Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. The project is, of course, as I've said before, to work together through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Now, if you're joining me for the first time, remember there's always a full transcript of each and every one of these podcasts available in any audio version of the podcast. Now, the audio podcasts are hosted on buzzsprout.com, but it doesn't matter wherever you're receiving your podcast from, whether it be Amazon or Spotify or Google or Apple Podcasts or any of the podcast platform. Within there, if you link through and look at the episode, there should be an episode notes page as well as a transcript and a chapter breakdown. So if you happen to be watching the video version of the podcast on somewhere like YouTube or Facebook perhaps, then there should be a link through to the audio on Buzzsprout where you'll find the transcript there. Now, I'd like to remind you that you are always welcome to do with these talks or the text of them whatever you want. They're in the public domain. They're there for you to use, to utilize, to create your own resources, to teach or to preach, to create sermons, whatever you want. A credit's always welcome, but the bottom line is you can use them in any way you want. Please take them and run with them with my blessing. Now, within an episode notes page of every podcast, there are links to all the various ways you can access my ministries. There's even a link to my sound design website where I create both the music and the background soundscapes for this podcast, but also some material related to other projects that I'm doing. And also in there, very quickly, you'll find a link to my Patreon page where I do make exclusive content available for my patrons. So if you're interested in that, I'll tell you a little bit more at the end. But anyway, that's plenty of information to be going on with for now. I'd just like to thank you again for joining me, and I trust that you're enjoying, but more importantly, that you're benefiting from having the Word of God as part of the rhythm of your daily life. I thank you so much for joining and encouraging me just by sitting down and by listening to this teaching every day. But for now, we'll just pause there and we'll jump in to the main study itself, and I'll see you hopefully again at the end. Bye bye for now. Now, we're jumping off on a new section today. We're going to be closing out the closing part of Genesis chapter 30, looking at this story of Jacob and Laban and how they negotiate the apportionment of animals in the future, which of course are viewed very much as that time the increase in flocks and herd as seen as the blessings of God. So we're going to spend some time, I think the next 2 episodes, looking at the closing part of Genesis 30. And as an overall general title for this, I've called this section over the next 2 days, Getting Rich Quick. And it's going to cover the text from Genesis chapter 30:25 to verse 34. Now, you've only needed to have spent 5 minutes on the internet in the last year, or maybe some time in social media, and you couldn't help but notice that there are thousands of get-rich-quick schemes. People are forever coming up with schemes that they will tell you will make you rich quickly. When was the last time, I wonder, that you came across a get-rich-quick scheme? Have you ever been approached about one? We've all heard of those scam emails where a supposed foreign prince approaches you and he wants to give you 10% of this colossal million dollar fortune if you just allow him your bank details so he can transfer the cash into the UK using your bank account. So what do you and what is your experience, I wonder, of get-rich-quick schemes? Such schemes are as common as leaves on the tree. They're all over the place. The problem is that none of these trees will ever bear any fruit, so to speak, meaning that they will not produce what they promise to produce. What about bitcoins? I'm sure you've heard of those. Is anyone you know, or are you yourself investing in bitcoins? Now, I know some people today are making money out of cryptocurrencies. But what is interesting to me is that there has never been a time in economic history when so many people are investing, well, billions worldwide, in a financial instrument that the vast majority don't understand on even the most basic level. And even a very glimpsing view of the science of economics will tell you that the main factors that drive any value in any marketplace are availability and confidence. And with people not understanding what they're investing in, I think obviously those type of investments, if you approach them casually, then they're at great risk of responding in fear with a mass exodus on any perceived downturn in value. But so it's interesting to me that all of this is in the background in our lives today. But did you notice that there's a passage in the book of Genesis that talks about a sort of get-rich-quick scheme? And if you've just read the passage on its own and didn't take a little bit of time to unpack it a bit, you may look like that's one that was successful for the protagonists. So what I want to do for us over the next couple of days is look at this passage and ask, what can we learn from this particular passage? What can we learn from this scheme that's set up here in the second half of Genesis chapter 30? So let's look with me, and we'll pick the text up at verse 25, where we're told this. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, Send me on my way so I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. Now let's pause for a second and play a little catch-up. You will recall Jacob fled his own homeland, Palestine, and he goes back to Haran, where his family roots are. All because of this conflict he's had with his brother Esau. When he got to Haran and he met Rachel, it was a sort of love at first sight scenario, but Jacob gets deceived by her father, by Rachel's father Laban, and he ends up inadvertently marrying Leah, the older sister of Rachel, having worked 7 years to get Rachel. So after 7 years, he doesn't even get the girl he wanted. He gets the older sister of the girl that he wanted. So thereafter, he makes another deal with Laban to work another 7 years so he can then have Rachel, as was initially agreed. So we open this passage. These years have been complete, and verse 25 says we're at the point where Rachel has given birth to Joseph, the last son of 12 that have been born to Jacob, not only from Rachel, but from Leah and the other wives. And Jacob at this point says, I want to go home. And that's what these opening verses are telling us. Jacob is telling his father-in-law and saying, look, I've fulfilled my obligations. I've fulfilled my contract with you, that promise that we made, that agreement that we made. And I would like now to take my wives and my children and all my possessions and go back from whence I came. And we see Laban respond to this in verse 27 when it tells us this. And Laban said to him, Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, Name your wages, and I will give it. So Laban did not want Jacob to go. Now I think this is incredibly interesting. He said, I've learned that it is because of the Lord that I've been blessed. Now please notice that Laban uses the personal name of God here. He says, the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Now we should stop and ponder on this for a while. If the people in your life were to say to you that they believe the Lord had blessed them because of you and because of the fact that you'd been in your life, well, for me, that's one of the greatest compliments that someone can ever receive. If someone said to you, it is a blessing from God that you are in my life, well, I think that's an amazing testimony about you. And that's what Laban appears to be saying here. But if you consider it closely, you'll notice he's probably referring to material prosperity when he talks about blessing. But be that as may, it's a testimony that he believes that God has blessed him because Jacob has come into his family's life. Now, the challenge for us as Christians, friends, is I believe we are challenged to leave everybody in our lives that we come into contact with a bit better off than they were before we met them, spiritually, of course. And that's the kind of thing that Laban is saying here, but maybe he's just referring to material prosperity. But he also says, because of that fact, he says, don't leave. Please don't go back to your homeland. He says, just name your price and I will give it. I want you to stay. And Jacob responds to this in verse 29. And it says, so Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock have been with me. For what you have had before I came was little, and it has increased a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I also provide for my own house? Now by this answer, I think that's why we can identify that the blessing that Laban was referring to was material, because Jacob, in his response, points to flocks and herds as the way that the Lord has indeed blessed him. I've cared for your flocks, he says, and they've increased, and that has happened, and that has been done by the Lord through me. I've worked for 14 years, he reminds them, and you have been blessed, and you have prospered financially and materially. But he's also implying, what have I got to show for it now? Nothing. So Laban says, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, and now here's the deal here, you shall not give me anything if you will do this thing for me. I will again feed your feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from them all the speckled and spotted sheep, and the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes before you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. So he agrees. And this is the first part of the passage, and it's really about this curious deal between Laban and Jacob. And the deal is what I've just read, and it may sound a little complicated to our modern ears, so I'm just going to try and take a moment and unpack it a little for us. What you have to keep in mind is that Jacob said, I will remove from your flock all the speckled and spotted sheep, the brown lambs, the speckled and spotted goats. He's saying also that in the future, the spotted goats and lambs will be recognized as his wages. All right, got that? So what's so significant about that? In the future, the odd-coloured sheep coming to me and the pure-coloured ones will stay with you. And he says that will demonstrate that what I have done by you is right. Now, what is all this business about speckled and spotted sheep and brown lambs and speckled and spotted goats? What's the significance in this deal, and what's the significance in the message behind the story? Now, it helps us greatly to know that in the Middle East at that time, sheep were normally white and goats were normally black or dark brown, and exceptions to that were very rare. So what Jacob is saying is, I'm going to initially take, and in the future maybe get the occasional odd off-coloured animal, and I'm going to raise them. And that alone should be my wages. And if in the future there are any white sheep among my flock, then everybody will know, and you will know, I must have stolen them, because I'm only going to keep and breed these odd-coloured animals. Got it? That's the deal. So what's really going on? Why would he want to do something like that? Well, firstly, very clearly, this plan puts the possibility of his acquiring wealth from here on in wholly in the hands and in the providence of God. If you recall, when Jacob was back at Bethel, God promised to care for him. So what he's doing by saying this is, he says, I'm really going to trust in the providence of God. That's certainly what it says on the surface. I'll take these odd-colored animals, and the Lord is going to multiply them, and that's how I'm going to get paid, and that will be my wages. In other words, he's saying, look, Laban, this is an act of faith. Jacob's saying, I'm going to trust in the Lord to multiply those which do not normally, and to give me enough of the type of animals which don't normally appear very often. All right, so we've got Laban's flock over here, all white, and anything odd-coloured is now going to go to Jacob, and that will be his wages in the future. And that's the deal. Got it? And the final verse in this section demonstrates that Laban agrees to this deal. Now, what our English translations don't really pick up the fact is that there is a real eagerness expressed in this verse. Laban's kind of saying immediately, okay, let's do it, he says. Now, Laban no doubt thinks, look, I'm going to end up keeping all these animals and have many, many more animals in the future than Jacob's going to have. And he's going to have to work very hard for me for very little. So for him, that's a great deal. So not surprisingly, he quickly says, let's do it. So that's the deal. But we have to remember who we're dealing with here. We're dealing with Jacob, someone who scammed his own father to get his brother's birthright, tricked his own brother as well. We're dealing with Laban, who deceived Jacob into marrying the wrong daughter. So we've got two con men, two deceivers, making deals with each other. This can get nothing but interesting, friends, from here on in. So they've agreed how they're going to divide these flocks in the future. So the first part of the passage really goes into some detail about the deal that they make. Now, the second part of this passage is how they're going to implement that deal and how they make it outwork for themselves from this point forward in the future. Well, we'll see how that all works out in the next episode. Okay, friends, thank you for joining me. We're picking up the story in part 2 this week of this story of Jacob and Laban and these two tricky characters and their supposed agreement with each other. We're covering the second half of Genesis chapter 30, looking at verses 25 to 43 today. If you remember last time, we looked at the point of how they agreed together to divide the flocks in the future, and we looked at the deal that they made. And in the message today, we're going to look at how they implement that deal and how it works out going forward. But anyway, that's what we're going to be doing today. But thank you again for joining me on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Before we kick into the main study, quick reminder that there's always a transcript available of each and every one of the talks that I've done, and that's available on any audio version of the podcast website. Doesn't matter where you're receiving your podcast from, whether it be Apple or Amazon or iTunes or Spotify, wherever you're receiving it from, there'll be an episode notes page, and within that there'll be a transcript. Okay, here we are continuing the story of Jacob and Laban. These two, some might say, dodgy characters, and their attempts to come up with some negotiated deal between them. And this is part 2 of my 2-part study, covering the text of second half of Genesis chapter 30. And today we'll be looking at the closing section, covering verses 25 to 43. And I've given these couple of podcasts the working title of Getting Rich Quick. Really should be a question mark at the end of that. So we're picking up the story, you'll remember, at the point where they agreed how they were going to divide the flocks into the future. So the first part of this passage that we looked at yesterday is the deal itself that they made. And the second part of this passage today is how that deal is going to be implemented. We're actually going to see how it works out in the real world, how it works out from this point forward. So we'll drop back in and we'll pick up the text in verse 35, where it tells us, so he, that's Laban obviously it's referring to, removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and he gave them into the hands of his sons. Now let's just back up a few verses to verse 32, where we heard about this deal last time. Let me remind you of what it said. And this is Jacob speaking. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. Those shall be my wages. So the deal that Laban had made with Jacob was that he could separate them. But when they get down to implementing the deal and dividing the sheep, Laban immediately, behind Jacob's back, does it before Jacob has a chance to do it. Now this immediately tells us, well, it gives us an insight into the character of Laban again, doesn't it? And also draws attention to the fact that A, he doesn't trust Jacob, and that he's also not going to honour the deal. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the deal was, if you remember, that Jacob would take care of his flocks, and that by doing what they'd agreed he could do, that would be the way in which he would earn wages, right? But instead of letting Jacob have access to the flock, he's given that part of the flock, or most of it already, to his own sons. So this is another indication of just how tricky this character is. And we will also see that not only does he do that, he clearly still doesn't trust Jacob at all. Because look what he does in the next verse. Then he puts 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So there's Jacob dutifully, diligently doing what he was expected to do, not aware of what's happened, and Laban has taken what should have been Jacob's sheep, and he's given them to his own sons, and then he gets them to head off 3 days' journey away. So there's a distance of 3 days between his family and Jacob, who's been left here. So Laban's clearly taking steps to guarantee that Jacob does not only receive what he should have received, but doesn't have the opportunity to deceive him either. Clearly he simply doesn't trust Jacob, no matter what he says. But we have to remember, we are dealing with two tricky characters here, two deceivers. So now it's Jacob's turn, and let's have a look at how he implements this deal. Now we're going to get to something really interesting, because we will now see Jacob and his attempts to manipulate this situation to his advantage. Now it's a little involved and rather convoluted, so we need to navigate through these coming verses rather carefully. But if we pay attention, I think we can get to the root of it. And we'll pick up the story in verse 37. Now Jacob took for himself rods, which means branches, of green poplar and the almond of the chestnut tree, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods, the branches. So he takes the branches, and there are 3 types of trees mentioned here, and he strips the bark back so that the white part of the branch underneath is showing. It then tells us in the next verse, then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the troughs when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat, they would come to drink. So the sheep and the goats gather in the heat, and they gather before these stripped branches that are around and in the troughs, and they mate in that area, and it appears that when they give birth, they actually give birth to speckled and spotted offspring. So that's not normally what you would expect to happen if sheep were mating ordinarily in that way. So what's going on? Well, let's see if we can sort this out. However, keep in mind that Jacob only had Laban's sheep at this beginning, and they'd already been stripped to a great extent of all the spotted and speckled varieties of the sheep. And we see he's taken branches of both the poplar and the almond and the chestnut tree, and he's peeled back the bark so that the right branches they'll appear white because they're stripped of the bark, and he places those stripped branches in and around the water trough. And in the fullness of time, it would appear that the normal coloured sheep of Laban's flock that he's caring for, they come forward and they mate and conceive in that area, and when they give birth to mixed coloured offspring. Does that strike you as odd? What in the world does this mean, and what's going on here? Is it possible that stripped branches in drinking water could produce odd coloured sheep? That's the question. Now we can see a little bit of manipulation going on here. It's reasonable to say that by surrounding the troughs with all these branches, it would mean that perhaps some of the weaker sheep wouldn't get through to drink enough, so there may be a way of in a sense, selective breeding out the stronger ones of the sheep. But what's this about coloured sheep being produced in the area by this strange method? Now, as you can imagine, the further you go into this, you can open up a bit of a can of worms. As Bible commentators, well, some go a little bit crazy trying to explain this and what it means. Now, this is one of those situations, yeah, well, studying the Bible can be really interesting, and it's interesting to see that if you go back particularly into the Victorian times and the early commentaries, the different and all the gymnastics that people come up with and all the theories they come up with to try and explain this. Let me tell you just some of the theories that have been offered over the years, and some that people still hold dearly to today. Now, one very common view of the time of a few hundred years ago, with scientific ideas coming through, that in fact this was really just a representation of a popular superstition at the time. There was a common belief that a vivid sight during conception or pregnancy would have an effect on an embryo. You've got to remember that up to about 300 years ago, no one had any idea of what really happened in the pregnancy phase in humans, never mind animals. And there was a great belief right up until the 19th century that the sex even of a human child could be determined by the state, even the temperature, some said, whether someone was hot or cold or not during the conception. So strange theories did abound for many years up to very recently. And there was a common belief that a vivid sight or a vivid environment during conception among animals would affect an embryo. Now, another theory says that this whole thing is founded upon a fact that particularly noticed in the case of sheep, that whatever fixed their attention during copulation would be marked upon them, their young at birth. And then there are some others who take the scientific approach and would argue that the chemicals in the wood of those trees was capable of affecting the animals. One commentator I read said that new scientific evidence suggested that was possible. They then didn't go on to quote what that scientific evidence was, and this was written nearly about 80 years ago. And then, of course, there is the other option that Jacob could have just been using selective breeding, and that would eventually enable him to develop a flock predominantly of spotted and speckled animals, because this story doesn't just take place overnight. It takes place over a period of a number of years. Perhaps the peel branches were just a strategy to draw the sheep to the area, because the animals would think there would be good food to eat there, and therefore the whole thing was just Jacob's attempt to use the local superstitions of that time to practice and to cover up his secret selective breeding practices. Now, whatever the explanation is, I'm not sure, and you can reasonably, as a Christian believer, accept any of them. But I do know that getting too wrapped up in trying to find the situation and try and working it out, you can end up missing the main point that the text trying to tell us, which is that Jacob was using an active deception. It was designed from day one to create a situation that would mislead Laban. And one commentator I read said when Jacob later explains to his wife, he does suggest that's what's happened. But what we can know for sure, he is definitely trying to manipulate this situation to gain a numerical, statistical advantage among the sheep over Laban. So he comes up with this really interesting and convoluted scheme. And I'm going to call it, because it has a feeling to me a bit like an ancient rich quick scheme. It's an ancient version of what we would today call a get rich quick scheme. He thinks, I'm going to peel the bark from the branches, put them in the water trough, and by doing that, it's going to, at some level, create a scenario where I'll be able to produce speckled and spotted animals, which remember was the agreed deal, that if that would happen, then he would be allowed to keep those, and that if it did happen to a large degree, he would then become a very rich man. Now, I suspect some people are coming to this passage and they see the whole bark and plants and animals and water and manipulation. They see it all as a bit of a fantasy. But the important thing is to think, what is the end result of this scheme? What was the outcome? Well, the next few verses will tell us. It says, the sheep indeed, they did mate. They mated in front of the branches, it says, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. And Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark coloured animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself, and he did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals, so they would mate near the branches, but if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban, and the strong ones to Jacob. So again, this is about manipulating the breeding program, trying to manipulate the situation so that he will become a wealthy man because of the reproduction of the animals coming out in his favor. And he deliberately has a way of identifying the stronger ones, and he sets those apart and lets the weak ones naturally end up in Laban's camp, Laban's field, so to speak. And then the conclusion to this story is in verse 3, and it says to us, in this way the man grew, talking about Jacob, exceedingly prosperous, and came to own large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys also. So the bottom line is, it worked. He did get rich. The scheme worked, and he ends up exceedingly wealthy. Now, notice the text specifically doesn't bother to explain how this selective breeding program works. It gives us no real detail of how it works, but it does tell us that that's what happened in the end. But if you keep reading through the narrative of Genesis, you do discover more about what will really happen. I'll just jump ahead because I'm sure you'd like to know the end of the story. Now, we're going to be coming back to chapter 31 and looking at the main text in detail of what that narrative's explaining. But within that, there's a little verse that explains to some degree what has gone on here in this preceding chapter. And it happens when Jacob is trying to explain to his wives his way of saying, really, what has happened and why they now need to leave. And in the process of that explanation, he says to his wives, Rachel and Leah, God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. Now, what was it the scheme that worked? Do you think it was the striped branches that helped produce the odd colours? Well, I'm not really sure. In fact, I would say no, not really. When it comes down to it, Jacob himself, when explaining what happened to his wives and giving the reason why they should leave the land and go back to his background, he simply says, no, God did this. It was God, in the end of the day, who blessed me and made me wealthy. So, there we go. Let's put this chapter 30 now all together, and I'd just like to make some closing observations. This is a rather straightforward story in some ways, though surprising in its detail and the elements and the twists and turns were in it. The bottom line is, when you look at the whole chapter, we see Jacob and Laban making an agreement together, but afterwards they both try and take advantage of each other. They both were deceivers, and they both try and scheme the other one out of their part of the agreement. But God, as always, overrules in every situation, and he makes Jacob a wealthy man simply because that's what he promised he would do. So what are we to conclude in this passage? What can we learn from it? Well, I'd like to close by making two observations. Firstly, Jacob, you can't question the fact that he did work for his wealth. Regardless of how he did it, he still had to care for all those animals that belonged to Laban. He had to manage the sheep and the breeding program and run teams of shepherds and servants. I think you could draw from this passage that the normal way to work will usually involve a great deal. The normal way to wealth, will usually involve a great deal of work and toil, as the Bible calls it. And that is clearly seen here. It is clearly part of what's involved, a great part of what's involved in the creation of wealth in this passage. Although it's not put at the forefront, it's clearly there implied. It's in the background. It's in the DNA of this story. And secondly, his scheming was not the primary reason that the blessing that he received and the growth of his material blessing worked in his favor. Based on the fact that in the very next chapter, he says himself, when describing what has happened to him, to other people, is that it was the Lord that did all of this. So it's not his trickery. So in the final analysis, the get-quick-rich scheme did not work, which is usually the case with such schemes. It wasn't the scheme, it was in fact the Lord. So that brings me to the last point that I want to make, namely that the Lord did this, but the important part was Jacob got to the point where he was able to acknowledge that. What this story draws attention to is when it came down to the fact that he needed to put all of these events in some sort of context, he was doing that by talking to his wives. He admitted that it was the Lord that brought the blessing, not his cleverness, not his schemings, not his machinations. One commentator I read, which I kind of feel hits the nail on the head, it says, God blessed Jacob in spite of his actions, not because of them. Now, this tells me that this gives us an insight into the clear facts of the way the world works, that many worldly people prosper materially for the same reason. Material prosperity is not necessarily a reward for godliness. Jacob made his own fortune to a degree, yes, but the text says that God allowed Jacob to become wealthy, and he did that through hard work. There was no doubt that element of deception, that element of Jacob's personality behind it. But perhaps you could argue the case that God could have done even more for Jacob and his family than if he'd handed over all the situations to him. If Jacob had placed himself under God's authority, he probably would have been blessed even more, because that's what God usually does. That is the normal character of God we see portrayed throughout the whole Bible. The reason for this section in the Bible is that so when we as people experience God's material blessings, we need to get to the point where we can acknowledge it, that it primarily comes from Him rather than our own abilities. He will use our own abilities, but the blessing is still from Him. And I think that really puts the finger on the pulse of this passage. So let me repeat. I believe the main lesson of this section of the chapter is that people should be able to recognize those people who experience the blessing of God in their lives, particularly material blessings, need to acknowledge that it all came from Him rather than just their own abilities, because their own abilities, your own abilities, are God-given anyway. Now that at no point also should deny the fact that there may be hard work involved on your part, but you should always acknowledge that God is the one who brings the blessing and prospers His children. One commentary I read said those who experience the material prosperity must acknowledge that it is a blessing from the Lord, not a product of their own limited ability. So the lesson of this passage, I believe, is primarily a call to acknowledge the true source of any success that we might have in life. If God promises to bless his people, then surely that promise tells it that nothing will stop him doing that, but also that if God determines not to bless someone, then nothing will potentially alter that situation outside of turning to him. So here's what I want you to walk away from this passage with today. I want you to ask the question of yourself, has God blessed you? Has God blessed you in any way today? If he has, praise him. Has God blessed you, and have you worked hard? And maybe God has blessed you, and both of those statements are true. But that what this passage is teaching us as it bleeds into the next chapter, it's really rounding the whole thing up and saying, however it works out, whatever blessings you achieve in life and whatever material prosperity you achieve in Christ, it is important always to acknowledge the part of God in it and the fact that the results of it are the blessings of God. So next time, maybe you drive a car, maybe next time you get in it, you should acknowledge where it came from. Next time you sit at home at night, you should realize that your home is not just a result of your hard work. I'm sure that was involved in anything that you've achieved in life, but what this passage is teaching us, regardless of that, we should never forget to acknowledge that the Lord is actually the source of that blessing. We need to acknowledge the Lord in everything we have and everything we do. I think I mentioned this before at one time, but when I was a young man, I drove some very silly and old cars. And sometimes when I got into those cars, I'd wonder if they start. Today, I thank the Lord that when I get into a car and turn the key, it usually starts. And I thank the Lord because as a young man, I got into a car many times and it did not start. So whatever it is you do in life, whatever it is you appear to achieve in life, please remember to always acknowledge the Lord. It may, to some extent, have involved your hard work and you using your ability, but it all, in reality, really just depended on the Lord. And any blessings that you have, in the end of the day, they came through him. So always acknowledge and thank him for any blessings that you have in this life.